In session 19 here, we're going to be looking at adding numbers together. Up to this point, we've been dealing with adding positive numbers together. Now we're going to deal with how to handle adding positive numbers and negative numbers together. The textbook did a very good job of illustrating adding positive and negative numbers together. So I'd like to go ahead and borrow from the illustration that it used. It talked about in science that many years ago it was discovered that there's actually what's called antimatter. In antimatter, when you combine antimatter or antiparticles with normal matter or particles and you combine them in equal quantities, they cancel each other out, basically leaving nothing left. In other words, they destroy one another. So I'm going to go ahead and use the analogy of that and the illustration of that borrowed from the book to go ahead and illustrate for you here the concept of adding positive and negative numbers together. Let's say we had something like this: plus 4 minus, or excuse me, plus 4 minus 3. Plus 4 plus a minus 3. What we could do is illustrate that with the particle-antiparticle illustration. First of all, what we're going to do is illustrate, that's the wrong one there. For positives, we're going to use small circles to represent the 4 particles. Then what we're going to do is we're going to combine it with 3 antiparticles. And the antiparticles represent the negatives. And the antiparticles are going to be represented by the dark circles here. So we can see here that the 4 hollow circles represent our positive numbers, and the 3 filled in circles represent our negative numbers. These represent the particles, these represent the antiparticles. Now remember, when the antiparticles collide or interact with an equal number of particles, they cancel each other out completely. So what happens when you take 4 and you combine it with a minus 3? Well, what happens? Well, these 3 antiparticles here will come over here and they will wipe out these 3 particles. And these 3 particles will wipe out these 3 antiparticles. So in essence, they destroy one another. After that has happened, what do you have left? You have 1 particle left. And what's that particle represent? The positives or the negatives? Well, it represents the positives. We can deduct then that from this illustration, a positive 4 plus a minus 3 is going to equal a positive 1. Okay, let's take a look at another example. Here, let's just go ahead and draw a line here. Our problem is now negative 4 plus a plus 2. What does that equal? Let's go ahead and just start in the order that our problem is written in. Here we have a negative 4, a minus 4, negative 4. That's going to be represented by the 4 dark circles, which represent our antiparticles. Our positive 2 is going to be represented or illustrated with 2 of the particles here. What happens when these 4 antiparticles interact with these 2 particles here? Well, these 2 particles will interact with these 2 antiparticles and they'll both wipe each other out. So after that occurs, what are you left with? You're left with 2 antiparticles. And what do the 2 antiparticles represent? A minus 2 or a negative 2. So if you start off with minus 4 and you add a positive 2 to it, you're going to be left with a minus 2. Let's try another example. How about minus 5 plus a minus 2? What's that going to equal? Let's use our illustration. we have a negative 5 here, so that's going to be 5 antiparticles. And then what we're going to do is we're going to combine it. That's what the addition sign here means. We're going to combine it or add it to 2 more antiparticles because we have a negative 2 here. So we're going to add 2 more antiparticles. Now, in this particular problem here, are there any positive numbers that we're adding together? No, we're just adding together 2 negative numbers. So there's not going to be any particles to add down here. So what happens if you start off with 5 antiparticles and you add to it 2 more antiparticles? How many antiparticles now do you have altogether? Well, you have 7 antiparticles. And what do the 7 antiparticles represent as far as a number? They represent a negative 7 or a minus 7. Lastly, let's say you got a plus 3 and you're adding to it another plus 3. What does that equal? Using our illustration, a positive 3 is represented by 3 particles. And what are you adding to it? You're adding to it positive 3, which is 3 more particles. Are there any negative numbers here that are being added together? No. Therefore, there are no antiparticles that are being added. So if we start off with 3 particles and add 3 more, how many do we have altogether? We have 6. And remember, 6 is the same thing as plus 6 or positive 6. To illustrate the next point, I've gone ahead and erased what was over on the right-hand side of the screen here. But let's take a look at one last example here numerically. What if we had minus 3 plus a plus 3? What's that going to equal? Well, using the same illustration, our negative 3 is going to be represented by 3 antiparticles, and our positive 3 is going to be represented by 3 particles. What happens when these 3 particles interact with these 3 antiparticles? They cancel each other out. So what are you left with? You're left with nothing. So what is minus 3 plus a plus 3? It's 0. So then, whenever you have 2 numbers that when you add them together, they equal 0, those 2 numbers are called opposites of each other. So minus 3 and plus 3 are opposites of each other. Minus 7 and plus 7 are opposites of each other. Minus 1,000,000 and plus 1,000,000 are opposites of each other. So in algebra, if you're trying to compare a number, an unknown number, and that number is x, how do you think we would represent the opposite of that number? Think back here. What's the opposite of 3? Minus 3. What's the opposite of 7? Minus 7. So what do you think the opposite of x would be? The opposite of x is going to be negative x or minus x. And remember, by definition, when you have 2 numbers that are opposites and you add them together, what's the answer? The answer is 0. That takes us to our final review point here, that when you add a number with its opposite, they will equal 0. That'll wrap up session 19.